Hello and welcome to the Crisis Point podcast. I'm Eric Sammons, your host and the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Well, the first thing I want to know for those who are watching this rather than just listening is you probably notice I have a new, I'll call it a studio, but really it's just another area in my office. I got this set up just to give a little more professional look, hopefully. My daughter, Maria, is actually a video production major at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and she ridiculed my setup before, so she helped me get this set up with what we had. Didn't have a lot of expenses for it, but we got this set up, so I appreciate that, Maria, for you, although she doesn't listen to these podcasts. I don't know why I'm thanking her directly here. Anyway, but Maria is the one, my daughter Maria is the one who helped me set this up. So hopefully you like it. You'll see I have my up above. If you're listening to this is the boring part. Sorry, but if you're watching, you can see I have the Crisis publication books up there. We got St. Thomas Aquinas right over here. We got some catechisms, the church fathers, and icons. Of course, I'm always going to have some icons there. So anyway, so that's the new setup. Hope you like it. Also, I just want to ask people to like and subscribe. I like to do that. So please like and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like this video. If you're subscribing, listening to it via podcast, make sure you subscribe to the whole channel so you find out when new podcasts come about. Okay, so also just one last bookkeeping thing. I just want to let people know that we are streaming live on YouTube, on Odyssey, on Facebook, on Twitter, and I think on Float. I've been having some technical difficulties with that one, but so you can watch us on any of those different streaming services. And hopefully in 2022, we will stay live on all those services, but who knows? The way things are going, we can never be sure. So, okay, so let's get into the topic of the day, which is the state of the reform of the reform. I want to give a little history about this, explain it a little bit, and then kind of say where we are today with the reform of the reform. First of all, let me just say what the reform of the reform is talking about. We're talking about the idea that the liturgical reforms that came in the Catholic Church, that came after Vatican II, they themselves have to be reformed. So the idea is that the reforms that happened after Vatican II have to themselves be reformed as well. Okay, so let me go back a little bit of history of this. First of all, one thing that is, I'm not sure how well it's known. I know it's well known in circles that are into the liturgy, is that the liturgical reform did not begin with Vatican II. There was an entire movement in the 20th century, the liturgical movement, the liturgical reform movement, that desired to reform the liturgy. There was this desire among some theologians, among some people, even priests, probably some bishops, to reform the Tridentine Rite. We're talking about the Latin Rite here. We're not talking about the Eastern rites of church, but the Tridentine Rite, the rite that had been established by Paul VI. I'm sorry, not Paul VI. Pius V. I was jumping ahead in history a little bit. Pius V, after the Council of Trent, basically he said he allowed for liturgies that were over 200 years old, but all the newer liturgies, he basically wanted to suppress them and make this the standard, what we have in the Tridentine Rite, traditional Latin Mass, we call it today. And so there was this desire in the 20th century by some elements of the church to reform that. They felt there was a need to reform. Now, one thing I also want to say is the idea of reforming the liturgy actually isn't even the 20th century phenomenon. If you look at the history of the liturgy, it's always been in a constant state of desire of reform, in the sense that there's always been some elements in the church say, hey, maybe we need to change this, maybe we need to change that. Often it's very small. Typically, it's very small changes. But sometimes there's a more of a desire to make larger changes, which is what happened in the 20th century, really. And really, I would say the crux of it, of the liturgical reform movement, was a desire for a couple things. First is more simplicity in the liturgy. Some people felt that the Tridentine Rite was too elaborate, too complicated. And so there's a desire for more simplicity. There was also a desire among some for more participation of the laity. Now, how that's defined was debated and stuff, but the idea that instead of the laity being passive receivers of the liturgy, that they somehow participate in it as well. So that was another thing that was desired. Now, we see actually that there was some movement of reform in the liturgy even before Vatican II that actually happened. In the 1955 reforms of Pius the 12th, he made some changes to the liturgical calendar, some other minor changes, particularly not so minor in Holy Week, but some changes in the Holy Week liturgies. So again, we see these different liturgical reform movements happening before Vatican II. But in Vatican II, of course, is when they really come to their full fruition, and they're endorsed by an ecumenical council. And it's in the first constitution, the first document that was actually approved by the council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which came out in 1963. It was 63. Yeah. It was the first one that was approved by the council. And it actually was a relatively uncontroversial document at the time. It was one that was the reason it was first is because there wasn't really not as much debate about it. Because the idea was, we all kind of think there could be some reforms to the liturgy. Let's put that in a document and say that. Now, one of the things that it mentions here's my, for those who are watching, my old Vatican II document, very well worn. You see, I've used it, spilled coffee on it. Actually, I don't drink coffee. My wife spilled coffee on it once. But anyway, I won't throw it under the bus like I just did. It's so well worn, I have pages falling out of the book. Anyway, so in here, though, in Sacrosanctum Concilium, it has a section on the reform of the sacred liturgy. Before that, actually has a section on active participation and what that means a little bit. But it talks about general norms. And one thing I wanted to read to you was this idea. It says that in order that sound tradition be retained, this is paragraph 23, and yet the way remain open to legitimate progress. By the way, that is such a Vatican II. It's such a Vatican. Sorry, I'm laughing at a comment Mike made about, I don't trust a man who doesn't drink coffee. What's next? You don't smoke cigars or drink whiskey. Actually, I don't do either of those two things either. My Catholic friends say I haven't fully converted from Protestantism. Maybe that's true. I do eat pizza, though. So anyway, though, in paragraph 23, it says, in order that sound tradition be retained, and yet the way remain open to legitimate progress. I was going to say that's a very Vatican II type statement where you say one thing and then you say yet this. It kind of gives both sides of the equation. A careful investigation, theological, historical, and pastoral, should always be made into each part of the liturgy which is to be revised. Furthermore, the general laws governing the structure and meaning of the liturgy must be studied in conjunction with the experience derived from recent liturgical reforms and from the indults granted to various places. Finally, there must be no innovations unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them, and care must be taken that any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically from forms already existing. And I think what's interesting about that paragraph is that on face value, sure, there's nothing really wrong with that. It talks about the idea that you shouldn't make any changes, any innovations. Really, shouldn't never make an innovation, but you should make no changes unless the good of the church genuinely and certainly requires them. And of course, who decides that and how is that decided? And it also talks about form. Anything changes should be grown organically. That's a key word in liturgical circles, is the idea of organic development. And that essentially means that a change should not be some new innovation, even though it used the word innovation, at least in the English translation. It should be instead something that grows organically. In other words, there's a desire for it from the church. It doesn't contradict anything that came before. It's kind of like we grow organically as people. I'm the same person I was when I was 5 years old, but obviously I've grown organically, but I'm not a different person. Likewise, the liturgy shouldn't be changed radically, but instead it should be developed organically. But one thing we should remember about this is that by stating this, there is the assumption that there is something, I don't know if I'd use the word wrong, but something that needs to be changed in the existing liturgy of the time, i.e. the Tridentine Mass, the traditional, what we call now the traditional Latin Mass. And most council fathers, if not all, basically accepted that idea that, yes, there are some changes that could be made that would improve the experience of the faithful at the liturgy. And so I think that's important to remember that. But if you notice, I mean, I didn't read the whole document, of course, but it's really not much more specific than that throughout. They give some specific things, but in general, it's leaving it open, the idea of reforming the liturgy. And so the idea of the reforms that happened in the liturgy after Vatican II, they were called for by Vatican II in the sense that Vatican II did call for reforms. That is true. And it gave some general guidelines on how those reforms should happen. Now, we know what actually happened after the council. We had a revolution in the liturgy. I don't know how you could say it was really an organic development, because what happened is that you had a committee of experts who basically made some radical changes to the liturgy. I mean, anybody who's attended both the traditional Latin Mass and a Novus Ordo Mass, by the way, I know some people don't like it being called a Novus Ordo, some people who attend that. I don't know what to call it anymore, because the whole ordinary form, extraordinary form distinction, Pope Francis obliterated with his motu proprio Traditionis Custodes. So, I mean, I think Novus Ordo is the accurate term for it. I realize it's being used as a term of derogatory term, but essentially it is the correct term. So anyway, the point is that the liturgical reform was in many eyes hijacked. That what happened after the council went far beyond what the council fathers thought was going to happen. Even the more liberal council fathers probably wouldn't have suspected that they make all the changes they did. And actually, the period from 1965 to 1970, we saw a change in a development even in that time frame, where the changes came slowly at first and then very, very quickly. But even more so, I think we'd all agree, even those who might not say that the Novus Ordo was really a more radical break from the traditional Latin Mass, I think everybody would agree, everybody who's an Orthodox faithful Catholic, that is, would agree that abuses crept in very quickly and were immense. They were very much part of the experience of Catholics after Vatican II. Was this idea of, was this abuses in the liturgy, where we have clown masses, we have just all these crazy things that went on in the Mass that happened, these abuses, and they were all done in the spirit of Vatican II. And so one thing I do wonder is, because of the fact that there were really no reforms to the liturgy from the time of Trent until the 1950s, but really 1960s, you wonder if there was this built up, pent up desire for reform that kind of went crazy then after Vatican II. It kind of was like, okay, we got to just change everything now. The world's completely different than it was during Trent, so we have to change everything. If there had perhaps been more organic developments occurring after Trent, maybe that wouldn't happen. Now, I will defend the fact that there was a real need during that time not to have radical changes, because you have to remember this is a time of great crisis in the world, in particularly in Europe, where the traditional Latin Mass, where the Tridentine liturgy was being celebrated, with the rise of the Protestant Revolution and questioning everything there is about Catholicism. There was a need, a definite need then, to have this raising the bastions, so to speak, and raising them, R-I-S-I-N-G, not the von Balthasar raising them, R-A-Z-I-N-G. For those who understand that reference, just go with me. But yeah, this idea of the fortress mentality, people derogatorily call it, but this idea that over the centuries, there was a need to maintain the liturgy as is because of the Protestant, in response to the Protestant Revolution. I think there's a lot to that. But at the same time, 400 years later, perhaps there was such a pent-up desire to make reforms that it went a little crazy. Now, that being said, so let's go back to the modern times, though. We see what actually happened after the council was abuses galore, just a great amount of irreverence in how the liturgy was practiced, a great amount of experimentation in the liturgy and how it was celebrated. And so there was a lot of people, even those who had no desire, no affinity for the traditional Latin Mass, there was a lot of people who thought this was a problem and needed to be corrected. And so you see, really starting around, maybe a little earlier than this, around the 1990s or so, you see the idea of the reform movement. And so the reform of the reform, basically, it's kind of part of the whole hermeneutic continuity movement, this idea that we need to interpret Vatican II in line with the previous tradition. We don't throw out Vatican II. We don't go with the spirit of Vatican II, but instead what we do is we interpret Vatican II in line with tradition, hermeneutic continuity. And out of this came the reform of the reform movement. This idea being that the reform itself that happened after Vatican II, it needs to be reformed. Thus the term reform of the reform. Probably the number one booster of this idea, it was Pope Benedict XVI. And maybe he still is, for all we know. But as Joseph Ratzinger and Pope Benedict XVI, he was probably the number one person who advocated for the reform of the reform. And, there's this great book, I have it here, called The Spirit of the Liturgy that he wrote. I don't remember actually when he wrote this. Was this the 1990s? Let me look it up and see. Year 2000, it looks like it came out. And he talks about things like active participation, what it really means. He goes against the common belief in many circles after Vatican II of active participation means the laity need to be doing as many things at the altar as possible, or at the ambo or wherever. Instead, he has a better understanding, obviously, of what that really means. And so this reform of the reform, one thing I've noticed is, and I want to just make it very clear, I was a big proponent of this for many years. And I feel like a lot of Protestant converts really backed the reform of the reform for a long time. I myself am a Protestant convert, and it just seemed like a lot of them backed it. And I don't know why. Maybe it might be, and I'm not trying to judge other people, but maybe it was for me at least, this idea that the reform of the reform is like the best of both worlds, between a super uber Catholic liturgy like the traditional Latin Mass and a more Protestantized liturgy, which is the newer liturgy. And maybe it make people like me, converts, more comfortable that we don't have this full the full what am I trying to say? The full traditional Latin Mass, but we do have something that is more like it, but yet not quite so much. So maybe people like me, Protestant converts, would be, be able to handle it. So anyway, that being said, the reform of the reform, there have been some noble attempts at it. I myself attended a parish that for 3 years that I was there, did this for actually a couple decades. It had a Novus Ordo liturgy that was celebrated in Latin ad orientem with an altar rail, everybody receiving kneeling at the altar rail, only men, only altar boys, and even the readers were always men. And so in a lot of ways, for somebody coming off the street who's not real knowledgeable about the liturgy, they might not even notice the difference between that and the traditional Latin Mass in a lot of ways because of this. And also, I know of other parishes that have done this and are still doing this, where they have these liturgies that are about as reverent and as beautiful as you can make a Novus Ordo liturgy. And so, the reform of the reform, is an attempt to embrace the reforms of Vatican II, but not go to the extremes that happen due to the spirit of the liturgy. And one example, I just saw one recently. This is not a dead movement in the sense that nobody belongs to it. I saw recently there was a document called the New Traditionalist Manifesto, and it had a lot of issues in it that had nothing to do with our topic today. But it did have it has a section titled "The Necessary Liturgical Renewal Was Begun, Betrayed, and Left Unaccomplished." So that's interesting. The necessary liturgical renewal was begun, betrayed, and left unaccomplished. And so it says, "We love the Tridentine Mass, which has spiritually nourished us and given us access to the lost culture of Christendom. However, we recognize that the liturgy was unable to develop organically in this era, all while Christian culture endured centuries of militant secularism and industrialization. Hence, some changes have become necessary to adapt them to the needs of our own times." That's kind of what I was talking about, the idea that the Tridentine liturgy did not adapt at all for many centuries. Maybe it didn't need to, but the idea that it didn't, and maybe it should. "Nonetheless," this manifesto continues, "we abhor the undeniable and widespread liturgical abuses which accompanied the implementation of the Novus Ordo." So this isn't like the throwaway line that Pope Francis gave in Traditionalist Custodes, where he's like, "Oh yeah, we shouldn't have abuses." I mean, they're saying we abhor them and we acknowledge they exist and they're widespread, it even says. And it continues, According to the very constitution instituting these reforms, talking about Sacrosanctum Concilium, I trip over Latin words, I admit it. It says, according to the very constitution instituting these reforms, the sacred liturgy should emphasize organic development, Latin, public vespers, Lenten penance, choirs for sacred music, Gregorian chant, and noble beauty. How rarely is this accomplished? It is no wonder that there remains a continual dissatisfaction with liturgical life. So what they're saying is that basically everything that the Vatican II called for, really, that's not what's happening. Instead, we're getting a bunch of abuses. And so they want to go back to this idea. They want to continue to have access to the ancient form, the Tridentine Rite, but they want to have a reform of the reform. By the way, I'll link to this new traditionalist manifesto. I'll link to it in the show notes. But this is an idea of a reform of the reform. So we see it still exists today. There's definitely people who embrace the reform of the reform. However, I will say that it seems to be a movement that is that seems to be dying out, or at least losing its influence. Like I said, I used to be a big reform of the reform advocate. I'm no longer that. I know a lot of people like me who were at one point reform of the reform people, but now no longer are. Most of them have gone over and just advocated for the traditional Latin Mass and the traditional liturgy. But I do think that it is dying out. And there's reasons for this, I think, because there are some inherent problems with the reform of the reform movement. And I want to talk about those a little bit here. One is the idea that just the reality of what actually happened after Vatican II can't be dismissed. It can't be forgotten. And it is associated psychologically, sociologically, in every way with Vatican II itself. I know that reform of the reform people don't like to hear that, but the fact of the matter is what actually happened after Vatican II can't be separated from Vatican II itself. And so what we see is that even if you acknowledge that the reform was hijacked, or these people say betrayed, which I wouldn't disagree with you necessarily on that. The fact is now, though, that betrayal is part of the story. And so has the Vatican II reform itself been poisoned in the sense that it can no longer really be the basis from which we work from? That, I think that's the key question here. Because what the reform of the reform is trying to do is trying to base the reforms still on Vatican II, what it called for the liturgical renewal movement of the early 1960s and before. And so the question is this a solid basis on which to build? Because it is associated with this. And another thing I want to mention is that the Novus Ordo Mass, by its very foundation, is about choice in the liturgy. It's about options. You have your four, more than four, but really your four main Eucharistic prayers. You have other things. You have a lot of options on how you can celebrate this. And so even if you have people who are celebrating it well, in line with Vatican II, which, I've seen a few places, like I mentioned, you still have people who can celebrate it much differently and be within the rubrics itself, not really be abusive, so to speak. And the fact that these so-called abuses have been allowed to basically dominate the church, then how much are they really abuses? I mean, we see that today, that if you go to a random Novus Ordo parish, you're going to find, in most cases, in America at least, which is my experience, you're going to find some problems. If you're somebody who goes traditional Latin Mass, but even if you're a reform of the reform person will find problems at most celebrations of the Novus Ordo, because there are problems there. And so that's another issue that you have right there in the foundation. Is the problem is that you have this this idea of options baked into the Novus Ordo Mass. And so you could easily celebrate it in a lot of different ways, and it's open to a lot of problems there. Another thing that I just want to read following on this manifesto, it also says, we do not doubt the validity and value of the Novus Ordo in the slightest. And I don't either. And I think most traditional Catholics I know don't actually doubt the validity of the Novus Ordo. The value of it, I think that's a debatable point, but the validity. Nor do we deny its dignity and potential. And I think that's where there's the big debate between more traditional Catholics and the reform of the reformists. Because does it really have the potential that the reform of the reform thinks it has? It's like we yearn And we yearn to see it universally implemented as the Council Fathers decreed. And that's a big issue right there. Was it implemented as the Council Fathers decreed? The Reformed people would say no. But I actually have a comment here. It says the implementation is the interpretation. Isn't the church today a more clear and reliable measure of what Vatican II set out to do than any gymnastics of things like hermeneutic continuity? I think that's a legitimate question, is that the implementation, how Vatican II was implemented, in a sense, is its interpretation, because after all, it's the same council, the Council Fathers who voted for the council documents are the ones in general who implemented it. And so that seems to be their interpretation of it. And this isn't like a case also where the Novus Ordo was implemented some crazy way in America only. We see this all over the world, that this is how it was implemented. And so with the abuses and everything like that. So I do think there is an issue there, that a debatable point there, that how it was implemented is not how the Council Fathers wanted it to be implemented. So I also would say that Vatican II is more than just the documents. There's always this idea of like, we have to return to the documents. People need to just read the documents. But Vatican II is an event. And so we can't really separate the documents from what actually happened afterwards. And this is what I've been saying a few times here, but I just want to make sure it's clear. There is now today an ideology even connected with Vatican II. We see this at the highest rank levels of the church. There is an actual ideology that's connected to Vatican II, that if you don't look at it in a certain specific way, then you are anti-Vatican II. We saw, of course, this is most seen in the Traditionalist Custodes, this idea that if you attend the traditional Mass, you reject Vatican II. And so there's this ideological view of it that just exists. We can't deny that. And exists at very high levels of church. And by high levels of church, I do mean Pope Francis and cardinals and bishops of the church. We see this in practice with what happened recently in Chicago, where Cardinal Cupich has banned ad orientem in the Novus Ordo Mass. Basically, you have to get his permission, I think. But what it means in effect is that it's banned. And in fact, I know of a priest who celebrated ad orientem the Novus Ordo in Chicago who stopped as soon as this came out, because it basically wasn't allowed anymore. And of course, ad orientem, there was never a call in Vatican II to remove that. There's nothing in the Novus Ordo itself that says the actual rubrics that say you have to have a novus. I'm sorry, you have to have versus populum. You have to face the people when you celebrate the Mass. Yet, what Cupich is doing is he's basically saying, if you celebrate the Novus Ordo ad orientem, you're in a sense rejecting Vatican II. Now, I know, and you know, that's ridiculous. That celebrating a Mass ad orientem is not a rejection of Vatican II, but that's what it's become. That's the litmus test it has become in the church today. And so there's this poisoned well associated with Vatican II. It's not the fault of the traditionalists, by the way, but because what we're seeing is that the progressives are, for lack of a better term, the progressives are basically making these various lines in the sand saying you cannot cross this or you're somehow rejecting Vatican II. And so there's really two camps that are forming in the church. And Peter Kwasniewski is the one who suggested this to me. There's the progressive and the traditional. And the Reform of the Reform is trying to be in the middle. It's trying to be this kind of middle way between them. But neither side's really allowing it. It's not the traditionalists really who are mostly not allowing it, but the people in power. Because remember, the traditionalists are not the ones in power in the church today. It's Pope Francis, it's Cardinal Cupich, it's people like that, Archbishop Roche and those people who are in power. And they're the ones who are saying, no, you cannot celebrate the Novus Ordo, even in a somewhat traditional way, or else we are going to suspect you of being a crypto-traditionalist, being really against Vatican II as we understand it. And so that's another problem with the Reform of the Reform, is that you can't, they're trying to exist in a church that doesn't really exist. It's almost like a fantasy world, a fantasy church, the idea that we can somehow use the Novus Ordo as the basis for the Reform, when the Novus Ordo itself has become this ideological bludgeon that's being used against anybody who doesn't go along with the progressive program. And also another problem with the reform of the reform is that if you notice, almost every single reform that they call for, the reform of the reform calls for, i.e., things they want to change about how the Novus Ordo is actually practiced in reality today, is basically just adapting and grabbing something from traditional Latin Mass. It's the ad orientem, it's maybe communion on the tongue, it's chant, things like that. Maybe more Latin in the liturgy, something like that. It's simply grabbing for that. So you kind of wonder, what's the point of it? What are you really trying? What is the goal here that you're trying to do? I think ultimately, when I was thinking about this, I think ultimately both traditional Catholics and the conservative Catholics who want the reform of the reform, they both want to go back in time and do a reboot. They both want to go back to a certain time and say, okay, let's start over from there because things have gotten messed up since then. The traditionalist wants to return to before Vatican II, maybe 1962, maybe 1955. Let's not worry about the quibble about that. But they basically want to return to the liturgy as it was before any of the reforms associated with Vatican II happened. The reform of the reform person, the conservative Catholic, he wants to return to basically 1965. He wants to return to, okay, Vatican II has happened. It said, let's have a reform and let's implement it. Let's re-implement it in a different way. So in a sense, you could argue that the traditionalist and the reform of the reform person are only 3 years apart, 1962, 1965. I mean, I know that's simplistic, not really true, but I mean, that's almost how you could look at it. Both are saying, let's do a reboot. And I think there's reason to do that because we know from reality that what has happened has not worked. It has not done any of the things that the reformers wanted. I'm sorry, the true reformers wanted, not the people who hijacked it or went crazy things. Like the people from before Vatican II who are calling for some reform, some changes. What has happened is we have just a liturgy that's being practiced in abusive ways, in irreverent ways. People are leaving the church. People are not drawn to the liturgy. It's not a beautiful thing in most cases. So I think it's right for all of us to think we basically need to do a reboot. We need to turn off our computer and turn it back on again, so to speak. And I think the question in the debate comes, where do we start over? To me, and this is something I've come to the conclusion over the past few years, it wasn't something I believed for a long time. I think the reboot needs to start back with the traditional Latin Mass, with 1962, basically. Because I think for all the reasons I've already said, I think that the well has been poisoned, reform based on the Vatican II documents on Vatican II itself, the Novus Ordo. I think trying to start back with the Novus Ordo and do a new reform, I just don't think that's going to work. I think that, and we've seen it. I mean, to be honest, it hasn't worked because it's been tried now for maybe 20, 30 years, and it hasn't caught fire. It hasn't really happened. And so instead, I think what we need to do is maybe go back then more towards 1962, 1960, something like that. And then also, I do think, though, that doesn't mean there's no need for a reform. But the problem is because the reform was so messed up over the past 50 years, I do think probably the wisest thing to do would be a reboot that goes back to 1960, I'm talking liturgically here. And then it just stays like that for maybe 50 years, maybe 100 before you make any changes, because I think we need a rest. I think we just need to go back and say, okay, let's just stick with what we have here, reintegrate this into the life of the church, and then we'll talk about maybe some reforms. I mean, I was just talking to Peter Kwasniewski, and actually this the podcast is going to be aired later this week. And he said something that I've often thought. I was surprised he said it, but I've often thought this. If they had just simply put the Latin Mass into the vernacular after Vatican II, and that's the only thing they changed, there probably would not be a traditional movement today, because probably most people have been like, okay, we'll accept this, and we'll just kind of go with that. Now, there would have been pockets that would have probably wanted the Mass in Latin still and things like that. But I think in general, probably what would happen is there wouldn't have been the liturgy wars that we have today. I'm not saying that we should return to do that right now, but I'm not saying that's something off the table either in the future at some point. Now, all this being said, I'm going to wrap it up here. All this is to say, I know this isn't actually going to happen. I know the fact is that the Novus Ordo is integrated into the church today as it is. And that's one of the arguments of the reform is, we can't change that. So let's try and make it better. And I get that. And I understand that argument. But whereas I do agree that it's not like all of a sudden a pope tomorrow is going to say, okay, we're going back to traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Rite, or anything like that. I do think, though, that's the direction we're slowly going towards. And actually, it's been accelerated in recent years, where the Catholics that are remaining, more and more of them are attracted to the Tridentine Mass, and less are attracted to the Novus Ordo. I know of cases where parishes which had a very reverent, really celebrated Novus Ordo decided to drop it and convert it just to traditional Latin Mass because they felt like, why don't we just go the whole way? And so I do think that's a movement. Now, when I talk about when will that happen, I don't know, 50 years, maybe 100 before that would really happen. I think that's the most realistic thing. But I do think that the reform of the reform is not something that has a long-term prospects in the church. I don't think it's going to work. The Novus Ordo itself, for whether it was intentional or not intentional or the reasons behind it, the fact is that well has been poisoned. It's been poisoned by the abuses. It's been poisoned by how it was actually implemented throughout most of the global church. And so I just don't think it's the foundation that we can build upon. Instead, go to the foundation we know worked for hundreds of years, over a millennium, which is the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass. Go back to that. And then maybe in the future, like I said, a ways away, maybe then talk about reform at that point. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I enjoy talking about these topics, and hopefully we learned something. You all learned something from this, and I want to again encourage people to like and subscribe to the channel. If you're still listening to it at this point, that means you did like it, or else you wouldn't have kept listening. So make sure you hit the like button for this one and subscribe to the channel. Okay, everybody. Until next time, God love you.